The reception hall was a sea of polished brass and perfectly pressed dress uniforms, a world of quiet protocol and mutual respect I had worked my entire adult life to join. As a sergeant in the U.S. Army, specializing in linguistics, my job was to be an invisible bridge in rooms just like this one. A joint nation dinner buzzing with the low hum of diplomacy. I stood near the wall, observing the careful dance of conversation, feeling a sense of peace. For the first time in years, I was in a place where my skills were not just understood, but essential. That peace was shattered by a familiar booming laugh. It was my father, a man who measured the world in square footage and horsepower, holding court with some local businessmen he'd invited. He was completely out of his element, but radiated a confidence that only true ignorance can provide. He was bragging, of course, about my brother, Mark, the family's golden boy who could do no wrong. My son, Mark, he's a real builder, my father announced. Just got promoted to foreman on that downtown skyscraper project. Puts his hands to work, you know? A real legacy. He then gestured vaguely toward me. My daughter's here too. She's in the Army. He said it with the same tone he used for my childhood hobbies, a phase I was supposed to grow out of. One of his guests, a man trying his best to be polite, turned to me and asked what I did. Before I could even begin to explain my role, my father jumped in, waving his drink. "Oh, she does translations," he said, the condescension dripping from every word. "Sits in a room and talks in different languages." I kept my back straight and my voice level, the result of years of practice. "My specialization is multilingual strategic communication, Dad." He let out a sharp laugh, turning to his friends as if I'd just told a childish joke. "Right. Big words." He then turned his full attention back to me, his voice rising to cut through the dignified murmur of the room. He wanted an audience for this. He leaned in, a cruel smirk on his face. "Listen, sweetheart. You really think speaking multiple languages means anything here?" Every word was a hammer blow, a public declaration of my worthlessness. The low chatter around us died. Several officers in their decorated uniforms turned to look, their expressions shifting from curiosity to discomfort. This was it. The grand summary of my entire childhood, delivered on the one stage I thought was mine. His laughter echoed in the suddenly quiet space. But as the heat rushed to my face, all I felt was a strange, cold calm. He thought this was his world. He had no idea he was just a tourist in mine. My father's insult didn't just hang in the air, it had roots. Deep roots that reached back through my entire life, pulling on every memory of being overlooked, of being told my passions were secondary. His words weren't a sudden attack, but the loudest, most public performance of a song I had been forced to learn by heart. The lyrics were always the same. My brother Mark was the sun, and I was just a satellite, lucky to even be in his orbit. Seeing the shock on the faces of the officers around me was strange. To them, this was an unbelievable breach of decorum. To me, it was just Tuesday. The clearest memory, the one that served as the blueprint for our entire family dynamic, was the summer I turned 15. I need to introduce you to my brother, Mark, the family's rugged, athletic golden child, who wore his confidence like a suit of armor. At 17, he was the star of his high school hockey team, and my father saw his own reflection in Mark's aggressive, straightforward ambition. I remember the night at the dinner table when my father, beaming with a pride he never showed me, announced he was sending Mark to a top-tier summer hockey camp. It cost thousands of dollars, a sum that was always tight when I needed something. But for Mark, it was an investment in his future. My father spoke of character, of leadership, of what it meant to be a man. He saw a direct line from that hockey rink to a corner office. At the other end of the table sat my mother, Susan, a woman who believed family peace was a garden that must be tended to, even if it meant burying uncomfortable truths in the soil. She navigated my father's moods by demanding tranquility at any cost, and my happiness was always a reasonable price to pay. As my father spoke, she just nodded along, her eyes shining. She glanced at me, saw the flicker of protest, and offered that quiet, placating smile that always felt like a warning. "Isn't that wonderful, sweetie?" She'd whispered. "You should be happy for your brother." The unspoken part was clear. Don't you dare ruin this moment. So I sat in silence, my own dream dissolving in my throat. I didn't see an investment in Mark's future. I saw the internal ledger in my mind ticking over once again, adding another entry to a long list of disparities I was never allowed to question. My dream that summer wasn't as loud as a hockey rink, but it was just as real to me. I had a letter of acceptance to a prestigious language immersion program. I'd spent years devouring books, listening to tapes, tracing the characters of languages that felt like secret codes only I could crack. This was my passion, the thing that made my world feel bigger. A few days after the hockey camp announcement, I gathered all my courage and presented my acceptance letter to my father. For a single stupid moment, I thought he might see it, the achievement, the opportunity. Instead, he barely glanced at it before pushing it back across the table. "A hobby isn't a career," he stated, his voice flat and final. The words were so familiar, so worn. "What are you going to do? Talk to foreigners for a living? That's not real work." He told me to focus on math, on science, on things that were real. When I looked to my mother for support, she just wrung her hands and said, "He just wants what's best for you, dear." That quiet betrayal hurt more than his loud refusal. The cost of the language program was less than a third of Mark's hockey camp, but it wasn't about the money. It was about what and who he considered valuable. That summer cemented the family's false narrative. Mark's work was tangible. He used his hands. He led teams. He built things you could see and touch. His successes were loud, visible, and easy for my father to brag about at barbecues. My work, on the other hand, was invisible. It was academic, quiet, and existed in my mind. In my father's world, if you couldn't hit something with a hammer or watch it rise from a construction site, it simply wasn't real. My passion was dismissed as a soft skill, a delicate, feminine hobby that was fine for passing the time, but certainly not something a person could build a life or a legacy on. This unspoken rule justified every disparity. Every time my achievements were met with a pat on the head, while Mark's were met with a parade. My decision to enlist wasn't born from a single moment, but from the slow, crushing weight of 1,000 of them. The final straw was watching my father co-sign a massive loan for Mark's brand new pickup truck, a necessity. For a working man, just weeks after he'd told me that taking out student loans for a linguistics degree was financially irresponsible. In that moment, I finally understood. I would never be seen in that house. So I decided to go somewhere my skills were not only seen, but were considered a matter of national security. The Army recruiter didn't call my passion a hobby. He saw the score on my defense language aptitude battery and called it a critical asset. I wasn't running away from my family, I was running toward a world that spoke my language, literally and figuratively. He spent my entire childhood telling me my passion was worthless. So I found the one place in the world where it was worth everything. And standing there in that hall, I realized he had just walked onto my home field. After my father's words landed, a strange thing happened. The familiar hot sting of shame that I had been conditioned to feel my entire life rose up for a moment. But then it just dissolved. It was replaced by a profound and steady calm that felt colder and harder than steel. For years, I had been absorbing these casual cruelties, letting them define my place in the family hierarchy. But in that room, surrounded by the quiet professionalism I had fought so hard to earn, the spell was finally broken. I realized I wasn't a child seeking her father's approval anymore. I was a professional, and he had just made a fool of himself in my office. The need for his validation vanished, and in its place was a sharp, crystalline clarity. He had no power here. My secret, the receipt I held that he couldn't possibly know about, wasn't a piece of paper. It was a memory from just a few hours earlier. My duties for the evening included acting as an informal liaison for the guest of honor, a highly respected French general. He was a key NATO strategist, a man whose quiet presence commanded more authority than my father's lifetime of loud proclamations ever could. He was thoughtful and observant, with eyes that seemed to assess everything with a historian's patience. Being tasked with ensuring his visit went smoothly was a significant responsibility, a sign of the trust my superiors had in me, a trust I had built quietly, one assignment at a time, far from my family's judgmental gaze. During a pre-reception briefing, the general had been speaking with a young, eager American lieutenant about the area's history. He was trying to convey a specific, deeply cultural point about a nearby Revolutionary War battlefield, where French and American soldiers had fought together. The lieutenant, bless his heart, was nodding along but clearly missing the subtext. The general was trying to explain that the alliance wasn't just about strategy, but about a shared philosophy, a concept that didn't have a direct one-to-one translation. I watched them for a moment, the gap in understanding widening between them. This was my world. This was my language. Stepping forward, I waited for a pause. "General, if I may," I said quietly in French. Perhaps what you mean is that the soil itself holds a memory of that shared promise. I then added a small, culturally specific anecdote I'd learned during my studies, a quote from a French philosopher about how allies are not just partners in war, but inheritors of each other's ideals. The general's face lit up with immediate understanding. The frustration vanished, replaced by a look of profound, almost paternal appreciation. He smiled warmly and replied in English, "For the lieutenant's benefit." "Precisely. Thank you, Sergeant Davis, is it?" That single moment of recognition, of being seen for the exact value of my skill by a man of his stature, was worth more than 1,000 hollow compliments from my father. And now, standing in that hall with his dismissive laughter still hanging in the air, the entire situation clicked into place in my mind, like the bolt of a rifle. My father, in his magnificent arrogance, had created a trap for himself. He had loudly proclaimed my skills were useless in a room where their highest practitioner was the guest of honor. I knew the general was scheduled to give the closing remarks. I knew my contribution had impressed him, and I knew that all I had to do was stand here, breathe, and wait. My plan was to do absolutely nothing. I didn't need to raise my voice or fight back. I just needed to let his own ignorance collide with a truth he couldn't see coming. He had built his entire argument on a foundation of ignorance, and I was the only one in his family who knew the ground was about to give way. The proof wasn't in my pocket. It was about to be delivered from the podium. The dinner began to wind down, the clinking of dessert forks against porcelain plates signaling the evening's end. My father, flushed with wine and self-satisfaction, was at the peak of his performance. He had just finished a long, rambling story about my brother Mark's latest triumph, a testament to hard work and real-world intelligence, as he put it. His business partners nodded along, suitably impressed, while I remained a quiet observer at our table. I didn't hear his words anymore. My focus was a solid, unwavering line aimed directly at the podium at the front of the room. My heart wasn't racing, it was steady, each beat a calm and measured countdown. I was simply waiting for the final act to begin, the one he had unknowingly written for himself. Finally, a senior officer stepped up to the microphone to introduce the evening's guest of honor for his closing remarks. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct privilege to present General Dubois." A wave of polite applause rippled through the hall as the general, a man of understated grace, made his way to the stage. His movements were economical and dignified, a stark contrast to my father's sprawling, boisterous energy. My father leaned back in his chair, a smug look on his face, as if he were granting the general permission to speak. He crossed his arms, ready to endure what he surely thought would be a dry, boring formality. I allowed myself a small internal smile. He thought the show was over. He had no idea the main event was just about to start. The general began his speech in French, his voice calm and melodic. I understood every word, of course, from the formal greetings to his expressions of gratitude toward his American hosts. Around me, the room was filled with polite, attentive faces that didn't comprehend a thing. They were hearing sounds, but I was hearing a narrative take shape. My father wore that same vacant smile, nodding occasionally as if he were following along. He's probably thinking about Mark's new truck, I thought to myself. He was a million miles away, lost in his own world of tangible, respectable things, completely oblivious to the nuance and power filling the room around him. He couldn't see the pieces being moved into position on the board. After a few minutes of diplomatic pleasantries, the general paused. The shift in his posture was subtle, but I saw it immediately. He gripped the sides of the lectern, and when he spoke again, his tone was different, no longer just formal, but deeply personal and resonant. Still in French, he moved away from thanking dignitaries and began to speak about the nature of alliances, about history, about a bond forged in blood and belief. He then delivered the powerful, poetic phrase he had been grappling with earlier, the one about the soil itself holding the memory of a shared promise. A profound, almost reverent silence fell over the room. Even the non-speakers could feel the weight of his words. The official translator, a young airman, looked visibly panicked, flipping through his notes, knowing a literal translation would butcher the beautiful, intricate meaning. But before the young man could even attempt it, the general smiled. It wasn't a wide smile, but a small, knowing one. He lifted his head, and his eyes scanned the crowd until they found mine. The connection was instantaneous, a silent acknowledgement across a sea of unaware faces. He switched to crisp, flawless English, his voice carrying a new authority that commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "But perhaps," he said, his gaze still locked on me, I can put it more simply, with the help of one of your own. The room went dead silent. Every single person turned to follow his line of sight, their curiosity piqued. He held the room in suspense for one more beat, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then he spoke the words that would bring my father's world crashing down. He looked at me and said, as Sergeant Davis so eloquently shared with me earlier today, "True allies don't just share a border. They share a memory." The silence that followed was louder than any explosion. It was absolute and crushing. In that void, hundreds of eyes swung from the general to me, and then, like a slow, undeniable wave, they all turned to my father. They turned to the man who, not an hour before, had loudly and publicly declared that my skills were meaningless. I watched the color drain from his face, his red, wine-flushed confidence collapsing into a pale, slack-jawed mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He looked at me, his eyes wide with disbelief and dawning horror. I simply met the general's gaze from across the room and gave a slow, respectful nod. In the ringing silence, I watched the two pillars of my father's world, his ego and his ignorance, get demolished by a single sentence. And the best part was, I didn't have to say a word. As the polite applause for the general swelled and then faded, the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken meaning. It was a vacuum, and all the energy in the room seemed to rush toward my father and me. Before he could even process what had happened, my own commanding officer was by my side. He didn't smile, but the look of immense pride in his eyes was worth more than any medal. He simply clapped me firmly on the shoulder and said, "Well done, Sergeant. Exceptionally well done." Moments later, the general's aide, a crisp and formal French captain, approached me with a small bow of his head. "The general expresses his deepest personal gratitude, Sergeant Davis," he said. "He was very impressed by your insight. In the space of 2 minutes, my professional world had affirmed my value in a way my family never had in 2 decades. Near the exit, as the guests began to file out, my father finally cornered me. His face, which had been a mask of shock, had crumpled into a pathetic canvas of confusion and shame. He looked like a man who had just been in a car crash he didn't understand. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy, all the boom and bluster gone. "How was I supposed to?" He trailed off, unable to even formulate the question. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel the familiar sting of anger or the deep ache of hurt. I just felt a quiet, detached pity. He was a giant in the small world he'd built, but out here, he was just a lost old man. There was nothing left to say, no lecture to give. I simply looked him in the eye and gave him the only truth that mattered. "I know," I said, and then I turned and walked away, leaving him standing alone in the doorway of a world he would never understand. The next morning, my phone was buzzing incessantly on my nightstand. The screen glowed with a familiar pattern of familial obligation and guilt. There were a dozen texts from my mother, Susan. They weren't apologies. They were commands, wrapped in the language of concern. "You completely embarrassed your father. What were you thinking? You need to call him right now and fix this. Family is supposed to support each other, not tear each other down." Her words, once capable of twisting my stomach into knots, now felt like a foreign language I no longer cared to translate. She wasn't trying to heal a wound, she was trying to shove the knife back in and pretend it was a bandage. Then there were the messages from my brother, Mark, each one more clueless than the last. "What the hell did you do? Dad is acting super weird and won't talk about the dinner. Why do you always have to make everything so dramatic?" He saw a strange mood, a disruption to his comfortable reality, and his first instinct was to blame me for it. He saw the effect but was completely blind to the cause, a lifetime of it. I stared at their names on my screen, at the frantic, self-serving words, and I felt the last frayed threads of obligation finally snap. With a strange sense of calm, I opened my contacts, found their names, and pressed block. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of peace. A quiet, digital liberation. A few weeks later, the entire incident had faded from the forefront of my mind, replaced by the steady rhythm of my work, briefs, reports, and translations. The drama felt like a lifetime ago. One afternoon, an official memo landed on my desk. I opened it, expecting a standard commendation for my work at the reception. It was that, but it was also much more. The first paragraph detailed a formal recognition for my outstanding professionalism and linguistic acumen. But it was the second paragraph that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a recommendation from the highest levels of my command, for me to be fast-tracked into a competitive diplomatic liaison program, a career path I thought was years away. I read the final sentence of the memo 3 times, letting the words sink in. This recommendation comes with the personal and enthusiastic endorsement of General Alain Dubois. It was the ultimate receipt, the ultimate validation. The very skills my father had spent a lifetime belittling had just unlocked a door to a future he couldn't even imagine. The world had answered his dismissal with a promotion. The following month, I was packing a duffel bag in my quiet apartment. There were no family photos, no mementos of a life I'd left behind. Just uniforms, civilian suits, language guides, and my orders for a temporary assignment at a U.S. embassy in Europe. The air was filled with the scent of possibility, not the stale air of resentment. I heard once, through a cousin, that my father doesn't tell his big stories at parties anymore. He's quieter now. Mark is still confused, complaining that things just feel weird. Their world was thrown off its axis, but I was no longer the moon obligated to orbit it. I had found my own gravity. My whole life he defined my worth by what he could see. I finally realized that my power was in everything he couldn't. I had to leave my father's small world to find my place in the real one. If you've ever had to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it, share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.